Okay, we're going to continue with Dar al-Islam. So we talked about the fact that the Persians kind of make a comeback, as they are wont to do. We also said that basically they are the Lady Gaga of the Middle Eastern world. They keep finding a way to sort of reinvent themselves, even when you count them out. Um, Remember that the Abbasid Empire is Abba, except they are the taxing queen, not the dancing queen. Yes, this is how far I've debased myself. Um, so, the Buyids are firmly in control of the Abbasid Caliphate, but then, lo and behold, the Seljuks arrive. And remember, the Seljuks are a Turkic speaking people. Turkey is a country, but remember, Turkic peoples who speak a Turkic language, stretch from the borders of Turkey all the way to Western China. If you've kept up with the Uyghurs of Western China and how they're being forcibly sort of assimilated, then that's basically an example of a Turkic group within China. So very diverse. So the Seljuks migrate into and through Iran, Central Anatolia, etc., and they basically fight like the Mongols before the Mongols. They are fond of riding fast light horses, not charging directly into the enemy, and using cavalry archers, basically bowmen riding on top of horses, to snipe the enemy from a distance. So, using those tactics, they defeat the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert. You don't have to know very many battles in this class, but basically, this was the battle where the old style Roman legions met their match. The Byzantine army, the Eastern Roman imperial army, was still of pretty high quality. It had that Roman sort of tradition and lineage and all that. But from that point onwards, the Byzantines sort of end up on the back foot. They are having to constantly protect themselves against first the Seljuk Turks and later on another Turkic people, dun dun dun, that we will introduce a little bit later. Um, so one of the unintended consequences of the Seljuk Turkish invasion is that it prompts Byzantine Emperor Alexius I, I think, to basically send a letter to Pope Urban II in Rome where he says, "Help!" and asks for Western assistance. And boy, does he get it. This is a lesson about be careful what you wish for. We'll talk about what he actually got a little bit later. What you should know is that an example of a Seljuk Turkic leader was Saladin, who was a fairly successful sort of military leader who managed to reconquer most of what's called the Holy Land from the Europeans. Basically, he comes around during the Crusades. And there were a bunch of European colonies right around here. Saladin takes them back. So, now that we've built up the Abbasid Caliphate, let's tear it down. So the end of the Abbasids comes from a group that, well, provides lots of ends to lots of people's kingdoms and empires. The Mongols. It's kind of their shtick. They were pretty good at it. So I'm going to pretend like you know absolutely nothing about the Mongols. The Mongols are a Central Asian people living in what is today the nation state of Mongolia, which is between the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. Mongolia then is much bigger than Mongolia is today. And Mongolia mostly consisted of different tribal groups that were hunter-gatherers, pastoralists that sort of moved around with herds of livestock, horses, that kind of thing. Um, so the Mongols, however, were slowly but surely unified under a warlord by the name of Temujin, known to us, of course, as Genghis Khan. Note, by the way, you'll see both spellings. Just kind of go with it. They mean the same person. Genghis Khan basically just means great Khan, great emperor. Khan being the Mongolian word for leader. as a sign of how significant the Mongols are, Khan basically filtrates down to lots of other different languages and people groups and becomes adopted as a name, as a title. For example, it's not uncommon to see the name Khan in a lot of Pakistani families. We'll talk about how a name for a Mongolian emperor becomes a surname that stretches as far away as India. Now, Genghis Khan spent most of his career conquering most of China, Central Asia. Around this time period, around the time of the Buyids, basically, you had Persian-speaking peoples spread out and kind of combine with the Turks a little bit. The Mongols under Genghis Khan basically conquer a lot of those kingdoms. There's one particular empire which has a name that I can't pronounce, the Khwarezmian Empire, something like that. Genghis Khan manages to conquer that. Now, Genghis Khan dies. Spoiler, in history, people die. So after he dies, the empire is slowly but surely split into several semi-independent tributaries. There's one ruled by Kublai Khan, which is based in mostly China. There's one ruled by Ogedai Khan. But what sort of happens is this starts a process where you see a multitude of independent Mongol states. One of those states is led by Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu. Now, Hulagu launches a campaign against the Abbasids, and he besieges the capital of Baghdad. Now, Hulagu was a prince of a faction of the Mongolian Empire called the Ilkhanate. And they're sort of concentrated around Persia, Central Asia, etc., as distinct from, let's say, the more like European parts of Genghis Khan's empire that's now spilling into Russia, and as opposed to the parts of Genghis Khan's empire that's consolidating around China. So, Baghdad is besieged, and I think there's probably a thought that, the Mongols are pretty good at, doing the horse archer thing, riding around in circles. Well, you really can't use that to take cities. Sieges, you kind of have to get off your horse. And it was said that Mongols were sort of born and raised in the saddle. So the question is, how effective are the Mongols going to be at trying to take a really large fortified city? Well, as it turned out, very. The Abbasid Caliphate, or the Abbasid Caliph rather, an individual by the name of Al-Mustasim, you don't need to know that, he tries to negotiate directly with Hulagu, but at this point, Hulagu just wants the street cred of taking the city of Baghdad. So his assault troops storm the city, and for about 3 days, he allows his troops to just basically slaughter anyone, and I mean anyone. It's estimated that anywhere from, some Muslim sources speculate that anywhere from 800,000 to 2 million people are killed, which sounds a little high. The more conservative lowball estimate from Hulagu himself is around 200,000 people. So almost 250,000 people die in the taking of Baghdad. It has to be one of the bloodiest events in human history. So just for comparison, anywhere from 90,000 to 160,000 people die with the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945. So you have an event that's almost twice as bloody and devastating as an atomic bomb. That's just how terrifying the Mongols were. Now, I do have to mention that whereas there was shock throughout Dar al-Islam at the destruction of Baghdad, and it basically was destroyed, at least for a short period of time, As you might imagine, the reaction was fairly different in Western Europe. So apparently, because you saw the destruction of so many of these Islamic kingdoms, there's a little bit of Schadenfreude that the Western Europeans experience. If you don't know what Schadenfreude is basically taking perverse delight in other people's suffering. And this actually leads to the emergence of a legendary kingdom called the Kingdom of Prester John. You see, there was an assumption that in the far reaches of the earth, there was a good Christian king by the name of Prester John. And Prester John was apparently good, God-fearing, and obviously no friend of the Muslim world. And so the destruction of Baghdad, the destruction of the caliphate, well, that has to be Prester John's work, right? Because they have to be good guys, right? Because bad people can't do good things, right? Now, as you can kind of imagine, the destruction of a 300-year-old empire throughout the Middle East, it causes some ripple effects. One of those ripple effects actually is pretty enduring. So there's a group of soldiers called Mamluks that the Abbasids basically brought from Central Asia. Remember we were talking about how they like to basically bring in foreign mercenaries and that sort of thing as a way to put down uprisings? Well, the Mamluks were brought in from Central Asia. And what happens is when the Mongols attack, the Mamluks are able to sort of take advantage of the situation and take control of Egypt. Among other short-term consequences, this is when we see Cairo established as the main city of Egypt. There's Alexandria always stays a pretty significant city, but the specific capital of Egypt along the Nile Delta, it shifts from century to century sometimes. In the old, middle, and new kingdoms of ancient Egypt, the capital gets changed all the time. So from this point forward, Cairo becomes the center of Egyptian state and political system. But because the Mamluks were also very good horsemen, they kind of knew how to fight the Mongols, or at least they could fight them on their terms. So they prevent the Mongols from spreading into Syria, Egypt, and of course the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. As a result of their rule, so craftsmanship, architecture, scholarship flourished. Egypt sort of reasserts itself as being fairly independent, which is interesting because Egypt is becoming more and more independent under a large group of people who are not Egyptian. They will be ultimately defeated by the Ottomans, but the Mamluks are still around. And in fact, the Mamluks only really disappear from history when Napoleon Bonaparte in the 1800s invades Egypt and basically destroys the Mamluks with a bunch of cannons. So, in your notes, try to answer these questions. See how well you do. We'll try to remember to go over that in class next time. Now, speaking of headaches for the Muslim world, we're not done yet because yet another group of invaders is about to show up. So we said that the letter sent by Alexius I to Pope Urban II is going to have some pretty significant consequences. Well, these are those consequences. So with the near destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire after the victory at Manzikert, Europeans are getting more and more nervous about Islamic expansion. To be honest, Islamic expansion has been fairly old at this point. I mean, it's the French had to fend off an Islamic invasion from French soil at the Battle of Tours, I think in 732. So, in other words, Muslim invasions are about 300 to 400 years old at this point. And yet, the near destruction of the Eastern Roman Empire seems different. So, chaos from the Buyids in Persia, the Seljuk invasions, it makes conquest of the Holy Land in the Crusades much easier for the Crusaders. the thing with the Crusades is that there are a lot of them. And on the one hand, the Crusades appear to have mixed motivations. On the one hand, it does seem like the Europeans want to establish permanent kingdoms in the Holy Land. Part of that is to ensure that religious pilgrims are able to visit sites like Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and so on. Some of it seems to be the fact that once the Europeans actually get to the Holy Land, they suddenly find out that occupying territory along the Silk Road is very, very nice. So you actually have a period where a European client state called the Kingdom of Jerusalem is established. Now, that gets attacked quite a bit, especially by Saladin, who basically rallies a good chunk of Dar al-Islam against the Crusaders. This, by the way, was the war made famous in the Robin Hood mythos. Good King Richard goes off to war and fights in the Crusades. One of the things that is quickly discovered is that Europeans might be barbaric and all that, but look at this. Then some tanky boys, medieval knights in full armor, were absolutely, utterly terrifying. I might show you a clip of to give you an idea of just how over-the-top terrifying these knights could be. So the Muslim army suffered some pretty significant reverses at first, but gradually logistics, superior supply, and of course numbers begin to tell. So ultimately the Crusades are a failure for the Europeans. They don't maintain a kingdom at Jerusalem, but they develop an appetite for several things that they discover in the world of Dar al-Islam. So for one, Greek scholarship was preserved in the Muslim world in a way that it just wasn't in Western Europe. So the Europeans once again become reacquainted with Aristotle, Plato, a lot of the classics from the Greco-Roman world. The collapse of the Eastern Roman Empire will also accelerate that as well. But looking ahead, there's this little thing called Wake Up, the Renaissance. The Renaissance is this period of awakening, hence wake up, or rebirth, where Europeans suddenly have this hankering for all things Greco-Roman. Arguably, the roots of the Renaissance sort of begin here. The roots of something else also begins here because, well, if Europeans find that they like spices from East Asia, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, etc., well, once they lose the Holy Land, they lose access to those goods. So they'd really like to get them back. This is where Marco Polo comes in, but of course, Marco Polo requires, a pretty long hike to get to East Asia. So this starts the search for a sea-based route to East Asia. In other words, here we ironically have the roots of Columbus's voyage to the New World. One important state that exists sort of on the fringes of Dar al-Islam is the Cordoba Caliphate in Al-Andalus, or what is called Andalusia today, which is really just a region of Spain. So basically, during the Islamic expansion, the Muslims basically make their way all the way up through central Spain, get all the way into France, but then they're pushed back by the Franks under the ancestors of Charlemagne. So, but they still maintain a strong foothold in Spain. And so what happens is that Al-Andalus and Cordoba, which is the city out of which that caliphate is based, it becomes kind of an exception to what we see in Europe. So whereas in Europe you see a decline in trade, communication, you see sources of information from the classical world disappear or get misplaced or just sort of get ignored. In Al-Andalus, you see the preservation of Greco-Roman knowledge. And you also see like this combination of both European and Middle Eastern architectural styles, which is still pretty significant to Spanish architecture even today. It should also be pointed out that at least at first, the Cordoba Caliphate was very tolerant of other religions. You actually see the emergence of one of the greatest philosophers of the Middle Ages, Maimonides, in the Cordoba Caliphate. Maimonides is actually Jewish. But that doesn't really play into whether or not he's able to successfully ply his trade as a philosopher, to the extent that anyone can ply their trade as a philosopher. So there's this sort of assumption or atmosphere of intellectual equality, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. I'm not going to pretend like it was always harmonious, but it was far better than what we see in much of Western Europe and, quite frankly, throughout Dar al-Islam. Now, eventually, that's going to be unraveled, partially because there are still countless Spanish Christians, and even though the Cordoba Caliphate seems fairly benign, it's still a situation where they're being ruled over by what they perceive to be an invader. And during this time period, political states in Europe are organized by religion for the most part. There's a reason why European states are collectively sort of called Christendom during this time period. So what this is going to set the stage for in a few hundred years is this period called the Reconquista, which is very, very bloody and absolutely horrific. But more on that soon. So one thing that might be confusing is if you look at a civilization that's in decline, just because it's declining in one way, maybe its borders are declining, for example, maybe it's losing in a war or military conflict, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is declining in every respect. Sometimes those periods of strife can actually produce some of the like a great flowering of culture. I mean, it should be noted that the great sort of golden age of philosophy in ancient Greece occurs during the Peloponnesian War, which was not exactly a fun time to be alive. So the Abbasids may decline politically. There's social turmoil. There's the perception that the government is ineffective, that they're excessive, etc. But it's a general period of urban affluence, creativity, and an expansion of trade that we call the Abbasid Golden Age. So this is generally dated from around 800 to 1200 CE. So it comprises most of the time period the Abbasid Caliphate is in existence, just to be honest. So the Abbasids placed a very high premium on education, both in terms of educating the young, but also educating, the flourishing of intellectuals. So like the Cordoba Caliphate, the Abbasids were actually fairly tolerant of other intellectuals and other scholars. So you have Harun al-Rashid, who is the fifth Abbasid Caliphate. He establishes the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. In the House of Wisdom, originally, it's set aside as basically a repository of scrolls, texts, academic things. But this includes texts that were from the Greco-Roman world, so the works of Aristotle, Plato, Socrates didn't produce his own works, but all the collective writings of Greek, Roman philosophy are stored there, plus, of course, the religious texts. So you have the establishment of not just the House of Wisdom, but also madrasas that are basically universities that transcribe basically texts from the ancient world. Aristotle, by the way, seems to be or will be sort of a common passion of both Western European and Muslim scholars going forward. Now for everybody's favorite topic, math. So this is actually a golden period for the advancement of mathematics or mathematical understanding. This is actually where we get algebra from. This is where advances in understanding of mathematics leads basically the entire world, more or less, to adopt the Arabic number system. So because Arabian civilization sort of stands at the crossroads between the Indian subcontinent and the Greco-Roman world, the Arabic scholars managed to sort of incorporate advances and discoveries from both civilizations. So the Greeks had pioneered trigonometry. Well, they are eventually able to sort of advance beyond the Greeks and correct their understanding of trigonometry through the addition of sine and cosine. I think I mentioned that this is also where we get the establishment of algebra. The Arabs also take a number system that uses 0 and has a base 10. So you also see, and this seems to be a kind of a common feature where in the Middle East there's always been this fascination with the stars and the planets, even though most civilizations find that kind of inherently interesting. So you actually have a sort of an early model for Copernicus, where you have Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who creates an academy in Tabriz and eventually provides a model for the movement of the planets. And this later on inspires a Polish astronomer by the name of Nikolai Kopernik, or Copernicus. And this is also where, because of those advances of mathematics, you see advances in basically everything else. Human anatomy and surgery is considered highly advanced in the Arabic world. Optics, paper making, and of course, cartography, the art of map making. So we'll cut it here for today. We will pick up with the golden age of Islamic literature next time.